Hola mis amigos y bienvenido a nuevo de mi canal de YouTube. El video de hoy es un poco diferente para mis videos de habitual. El tema de este video es sobre aprendiendo español y mis razones para aprendiendo esta lengua. He estado aprendiendo esta lengua hace 1 año más o menos. Okay, that was a struggle. If you can't already tell, Spanish is definitely not my first language. In fact, it's the fourth language that I've tried to pick up over the years. My first most fluent language being English, followed by Cantonese, which is my native tongue, which I speak at home with my family. And then I learned Mandarin over the years while I was completing my high school certificate, and that was a big struggle. And now I'm learning Spanish. So this whole video is going to be talking about my experience learning Spanish, why I'm learning the language, and also my tips and tricks on how to improve in the language. I find that a lot of people will tend to be pretty surprised when I tell them that I'm learning Spanish. I think maybe there aren't that many Spanish speakers in Australia compared to in America due to its proximity to South America and Mexico. But I suppose in Australia here, people tend to learn languages like French or Italian as a second language at school. Could also do with the fact that I'm Asian, and I find that we tend to pick up languages which are similar to our mother tongue. I've got quite a few Asian friends who learned Japanese or Korean at one point, but that could also just do with the fact that I guess anime and Japanese culture are very huge and popular. Actually, I was weighing off between learning Spanish and Japanese at some point, so I think Japanese is probably going to be on the list next if I do learn another language after this and I haven't run out of steam or burnt out or whatever. And in fact, I actually might be traveling to Japan later this year, which will be very exciting, and I will definitely be vlogging that. So in terms of why I went with Spanish, I think I went with Spanish because I wanted to try something a bit different and step outside of my comfort zone. I've never really had the chance to learn a European, let alone Latin American language before, whereas I've had opportunities to learn Asian languages by speaking with family and also during my high school years. So I felt like with Spanish that would force me to interact with, I guess, a different subset of people compared with, let's say, learning Japanese or another Asian language. So basically force me outside my comfort zone and make me sort of, I guess, learn about a culture that I would not otherwise know much about. In fact, I knew nothing about. And this is just my impression, but I feel like Spanish speakers and the Spanish speaking world in general seem to be very kind of fun and free-spirited people, and I kind of just wanted to completely immerse myself in something different, so here I am. Another consideration was how widely spoken Spanish is. So it's, I think off the top of my head, probably the third most widely spoken language. I could be wrong, after English and Chinese, and it's pretty much spoken all across Spain and Latin America, so it could open up a lot of doors in the future. And it happens that the more I speak the language, the more I've fallen in love with it. I find that Spanish is such a fun language. In terms of difficulty, I'd say that it's definitely quite decently easy to pick up as an English speaker. This is coming from someone who spent all of their weekends growing up crying over learning Chinese at Chinese school. So, you know, my Asian viewers, you guys will understand, right? So I find that Spanish is a really fun language, and that's kind of incentive in itself to practice. And I definitely didn't find going to Spanish lessons as much of a chore as I did find with Chinese. You know, I love the Chinese language, but it's pretty hard. Like, the writing system was just not designed to be easy, I feel like. I mean, come on, let's be real. The Chinese writing system was so difficult that they had to introduce a whole simplified system just because the traditional characters were so complicated. All right, let's talk about resources for learning Spanish. I'll talk about online resources and apps. The first one everyone surely would have heard of, Duolingo, a very common mobile-based app. If you haven't heard of it, you probably live under a rock. I find that it's a very helpful tool for remembering words and building up vocabulary. It's very low effort and definitely something that you can use to pick up the basics with it. It was in fact my first exposure to Spanish. So I tried it out of curiosity to see if I thought I would enjoy the language. So I think it's very good in that respect. If you just want to try out a language for a bit without any commitment and see if you think you would enjoy learning it and picking it up, I feel like Duolingo is a very helpful tool for beginners because it's so repetitive that it is effective at, I guess, essentially drilling down vocabulary in your head, but maybe not so much of a helpful tool for more intermediate speakers. I think it's a good resource and I'd encourage you to use it as long as it's not the only tool that you use to learn the language, because you definitely need to be, I guess, having someone teach you grammar and like the correct use of tenses, punctuation, and you ideally need to be speaking the language with someone so that you can practice your conversational skills. Another helpful online tool that I found was beepboop.us. So that is a website which allows you to participate in live classes with an instructor. You don't even have to turn your camera on, which is perfect. So you could literally do it in like half an hour every day while you're wearing your pajamas or something. Classes are basically split into 3 levels. So they've got beginner, intermediate, and a higher difficulty level, which I assume is kind of just like upper intermediate. I'm not too sure because when I tried the app, I was just doing beginner level, and all of the topics I found on Beep Boop were pretty good, very conversational topics such as, you know, what's the weather like today? They talk about going to doctors, that kind of stuff. And I think sometimes they even cover like Netflix shows like Money Heist, that sort of thing. So you get to do like a little conversation with your instructor about those kind of topics. I used the free version, which I found was pretty decent. So that allowed me to either observe classes or join in the classes. But it will cut you off around the last 5 to 10 minutes of the class, which is something you need to be aware of. So if you have the means, I encourage you to use the paid version, but I think because the website is kind of tailored towards US residents, it's a bit harder to get your money's worth if you don't live within the US time zone. So for example, because I live in Australia, I found that most of the classes on Beep Boop were held at really odd hours, like during US hours. So the classes would basically run like at 2 a.m. and the only classes I could really join were the ones like at 9 or 10 a.m. on weekends. So definitely something to have a think about. Another tool which I've heard of and I've only used fairly limitedly is an app called Tandem. So that's basically a language exchange app where you can set up a profile and say what language you want to learn and what language you can teach others. So there's a whole lot of people out there who maybe want to learn English or another language that you speak, and you guys can, you know, have a private chat where you just, I guess, send texts and even voice messages. There's a few handy functions, like if that person makes an error, you can, I think, hold down on it and correct them. I haven't really used that app extensively, so I can't really comment on it. It has a lot of like random functions, like you can filter for, I don't know, perhaps you feel more comfortable speaking with a female person, so, or someone of the same gender. I had a chat with like a Mexican guy once, so we exchanged a few text messages, but I think he like lost a bit of patience. I don't know, like it could be a bit hit or miss with language exchange apps. I can't really comment too much because I haven't used that much. As with any app, just be careful. Could be creepy people out there, I don't know. Another tool that you could consider using is like a language exchange group or meetup. So I think if you go to meetup.com and you filter for like language exchange or Spanish language exchange, there are quite a few search results. Like I think I searched that up once. I live in Melbourne. It might depend on where you live. I haven't really gone to one yet, but I feel like that could be a possibility in the future to meet some cool Spanish speaking people and also just like have a language exchange. Obviously, another very easy way to improve your language is to sign up for Spanish language classes. I'm currently doing it at the moment, so I'll do on average a 90-minute class every week on a weekday night. There are a few language schools in Australia. My brother actually learned Spanish as well a couple of years before me, so he had a couple of good recommendations. One of those schools was the Traveling Koala and the other is Spanish Cat. I haven't been to Traveling Koala, but I did do Spanish Cat for about 5 different levels. So their levels are set from 1A, 1B, all the way up to level 7. And you don't need any prior knowledge of Spanish before joining these classes. So if you join at the bottom level, it's fairly beginner friendly. I found it very helpful to keep motivated by going to classes because without classes, I feel like you need to be very disciplined and you have to set your own regime. So it's definitely a lot easier if you enroll in the class. It's kind of like joining a gym. Once you join, you kind of end up having to go. So far, the classes have been very fun. They're all held online, but we go through kind of practical exercises. They do set a tiny bit of homework after lessons so that you can have activities to work on throughout the week, but there aren't any like exams or anything. So I guess it's very different to like learning a language at university, I'd say. It's a lot more of an informal environment, and it was a very fun experience. I had a really funny teacher from Colombia living in Sydney. He was teaching, I think, a class of about 6 or 7 of us living around all different parts of Australia. Definitely was the highlight of my weekday nights, I think, for a while, especially during lockdown. My final hack for learning Spanish or any other language is basically to change the subtitles on whatever show you're watching and make it the language you're learning. So sometimes even when I'm watching English speaking or American TV shows, I'll toggle to the function at the bottom. I think Netflix is very good for this, and I'll change the subtitles to Spanish. It's not a substitute for actual learning, but I've found that it's a very great low effort way to get exposed to the language more. It's also taken away most of the guilt I find in watching Netflix, so could be a good or a bad thing, take it or leave it. Or you could just watch the shows in the actual language you're trying to learn. So watch actual Spanish speaking shows. So I did watch quite a few. I watched Money Heist and I watched Elite. And now I'm trying to move on to, I suppose, Mexican speaking. Now I'm trying to move on to Mexican shows. I've heard that with learning Spanish, there are a lot of different variations of Spanish, depending on what region. So Spanish is a bit different to like Mexican Spanish or Spanish spoken in other parts of Latin America. I've heard that Mexican Spanish tends to be a bit more beginner friendly because it's a little bit slower than I guess Spanish. So I've got a few Mexican shows that I want to watch, just haven't gone around to it. So really want to watch La Reina del Sur or Queen of the South. That's on my list next. Literally filming this in a different outfit because I almost forgot to include this in the video, but another really great way to improve your Spanish listening skills is by listening to Spanish speaking podcasts. Personally, my favorite one is Simple Stories in Spanish. What happens in that podcast is that a simple story will be narrated in Spanish. Sometimes the story will be like a children's story. Other times it would be based off a popular legend or myth in the Spanish speaking world. and sometimes I think she covers off on customs and cultural sort of discussions as well, which is a really great way to, I guess, learn more about Spanish and Latin American culture. The really great thing is that sometimes the stories are narrated a couple of times, so she'll have the same version of the story in present tense and then the same story told in past tense. So that's a really good way to get more familiar with, I guess, speaking Spanish in, I guess, present and past tense. This is actually one of my favorite podcasts because I found that with a lot of other Spanish speaking podcasts, even though they're marketed as being for beginners, they were still too hard for me to comprehend and too fast. But this one is like a perfect pace. I found that when I first started listening to it, I could maybe understand 50% of the podcast, but now my Spanish has improved and I can understand maybe 80 or 90% of most of the stories. And she also gives a bit of a breakdown of the common and reoccurring vocabulary before the start of the podcast. Those are probably all of the resources and tips and tricks that I use to learn Spanish. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will consider making Spanish speaking content in the future. Like, I could maybe take a video of myself trying to do a Spanish test for fun. Yeah, it's been a very fun experience. Highly encourage you to learn the language if you are maybe thinking about it but hesitating a bit. Hope to see you guys in the next video. Gracias todos para ver este video y hasta el próximo video.